52 elk were loaded into transport crates in land between the lakes, Kentucky, in the autumn of 2001. Scientists estimated it would take a generation to see meaningful ecological results in the Smoky Mountains. It did not take a generation. It took a single season. That shouldn't have been possible. The valleys of Cataloochee had been ecologically dormant for nearly 2 centuries. Shrubs had consumed the old meadow floors. Grasses had thickened and locked. The sight lines that once made this landscape functional for hawks, for rabbits, for the entire predator network that depended on open ground had quietly closed. The mountains looked, to the 2 million tourists who visited every year, exactly as they should. They did not look broken, but something measurable was missing, and the ecosystem had been paying the price since roughly 1775, when the last elk in North Carolina was killed somewhere in the southern Appalachians. What happened after those 52 animals were released is not the story of a slow, careful recovery. It is the story of a landscape that remembered what it was supposed to be. Within months, the monitoring teams were recording changes they hadn't modeled. Soil composition, canopy spacing, species movement in corridors that had been effectively closed for 150 years. The elk weren't grazing randomly. They were working, and they were more efficient at ecological restoration than any management program the Park Service had ever funded. But here is what the population data would eventually reveal that no one fully anticipated going in. These 52 animals didn't just survive. They built something. And what they built would reach far beyond the valley, far beyond the park boundary, and reshape the way conservation scientists think about the southern Appalachians entirely. This is the story of what 52 animals gave back to a mountain range that had forgotten them, and what the mountains gave back in return. The last elk in North Carolina didn't vanish in a catastrophe. There was no single event, no documented final hunt. Sometime around the 1790s, the historical record simply goes quiet, and the mountains went with it. For generations before that silence, elk had been the primary force shaping the Appalachian Valley floors. Their grazing kept meadows open. Their movement compressed soil and redirected water. Their weight and their appetite were, in ways no one fully understood at the time, structural. Remove them, and the structure begins to fail slowly, invisibly, in ways that look from a distance like nothing at all. By the late 1990s, the National Park Service had a question it could no longer postpone. What if what we're protecting is already a shadow of what this place is supposed to be? That question would take years to answer. And the answer would make a lot of people very uncomfortable. The Park Service's answer took the better part of a decade to arrive. Feasibility studies, stakeholder consultations, environmental impact assessments. The biology was relatively straightforward. The politics were not. The data scientists were about to record changes that didn't just defy their models. They fundamentally rewrote the rules of forest management. If you're as fascinated by these impossible recoveries as we are, hit subscribe. We're documenting every step of how these animals are rebuilding the wild, and you won't want to miss what happens when they hit the park boundaries. The crates opened. The elk stepped out onto valley floor that their ancestors had shaped for millennia. What happened in the weeks that followed, no management plan had predicted. The first thing the monitoring teams noticed wasn't a population number. It was a sight line. Within months of the release, sections of Cataloochee Valley that had been locked under decades of unchecked vegetation were opening up. The elk were grazing with a precision that no human management program had matched. The Park Service had spent years running mechanical mowing operations across these same meadows, expensive, seasonal, never quite sufficient. The elk rendered that entire approach obsolete. They grazed selectively, moving in patterns that tracked the valley's natural drainage and soil composition, as though the landscape itself was directing them. Researchers confirmed it through exclosure plots, fenced sections where elk were deliberately excluded, which allowed direct comparison with grazed areas. The difference was visible within a single growing season. Inside the exclosures, vegetation thickened and closed. Outside, the meadow structure held open. That opening mattered for species far beyond the elk themselves. Red-tailed hawks returned to hunting corridors that had been functionally closed for over a century. Small mammal movement increased across valley floors that, weeks earlier, offered no viable passage. DNA-based population assessments conducted by the National Park Service and the University of Tennessee told a story the headcounts alone couldn't fully capture. The herd wasn't just surviving, it was genetically diversifying and demographically expanding. By the time the long-term studies were fully tabulated, the population had grown to over 250 animals. The tracking data told the story before the researchers were ready to tell it publicly. Bull elk, fitted with GPS collars, were moving beyond the Cataloochee Valley boundary. Not lost, not disoriented. Moving with the directional consistency of animals following terrain, they understood instinctively ridge lines, river drainages, elevation gradients. that their ancestors had navigated for thousands of years before the species vanished from these mountains entirely. The herds reached the boundary lands of the eastern band of Cherokee Indians. They moved into adjacent national forest land. Sightings were reported in communities that hadn't recorded an elk in living memory, in some cases, in any memory at all. This was not part of the original reintroduction plan. Bugle of a bull elk is not a subtle sound. It carries across ridge lines. It fills valleys. It is the kind of sound that, once heard, is difficult to place in any category other than ancient. Hikers in Cataloochee began reporting it within the first autumn after the release. A sound that had been absent from these mountains since before the American Revolution returned, not through any management protocol, but because the animals were simply doing what elk do in autumn. Ecosystems do not forget. The structural memory of a landscape, the soil gradients, the drainage patterns, the canopy spacing that large herbivores maintained for thousands of years, persists long after the animals that built it are gone. It waits. And when the architects return, the landscape responds with a speed that our management timelines never accounted for. The question this leaves is not a small one. How many other mountain systems, forest floors, and valley meadows are currently being managed as though they are complete, when the species that made them functional haven't been present for a century or more? How many recoveries are waiting on the other side of a political feasibility study? We don't have a full answer to that. But the next story we found suggests the pattern runs deeper than any single reintroduction project. It begins in a landscape that had been written off entirely, not for decades, but for generations, and with a species that most of the scientific community had already reclassified as a conservation loss. What happened there raises questions about what we think we know about the point of no return. The mountains were not dying. They were waiting for something to come home.